Hello, it's Alison from Bag Lady Birdland. So, welcome. So today I'm going to be talking to you about necklines. Have you ever made a top or a dress with a woven fabric, and when you come in to finish it, the neckline has stretched out of shape? You've got wobbly neckline happening, or the V is just a bit saggy, doesn't fit to your facing. It can be really frustrating. Now, I've got one simple top tip that will help you to eliminate that stretched out neckline and wobbly necklines whenever you're making a garment from a woven fabric. And that top tip is stay stitching. Now, most patterns will tell you to stay stitch and tell you which direction to do it in. But if you come across a pattern that hasn't got instructions with regard to stay stitching, I'm going to show you how, which direction to do it in, and just how to help stop that neckline from stretching out of shape. Okay, so let's get stay stitching. The very first thing to tell you about stay stitching is it's really important that it is the first thing you do before you take the pattern off the fabric. Or as soon as you take the pattern off the fabric, I should say. So the reason that stay stitching is so important is that with necklines, particularly V-necks, but also round or scoop necks, part of the neckline is on the bias. So that's whether it's a V-neck, where it is cut on a diagonal, or whether it's a round neck or a scoop neck, where you would have a part of that neckline where the curve would be on the bias part of the fabric, so that would potentially cause it to stretch out of shape. So I have used a muslin fabric for this, so it's a real open weave. So in theory, it would stretch out a lot because there's a lot of room within the weave for the fabric to kind of crunch up closer together, but also for it to stretch out in the opposite direction. Stay stitch a V-neck, the V-neck here. So to stay stitch a V-neck, what we want to do is come from the shoulder down to the point of the V, and then flip this over and stitch from the shoulder to the point of the V. Stay stitching is a single row of stitching on a single layer of fabric, just a normal straight stitch. I do not change my stitch length at all, so I keep my stitch length on 2.5, and you want your stitches to be within the seam allowance. So you can use, depending on what the seam allowance is, I just line up the edge of the presser foot with the edge of the fabric, needle down. You don't want to back tack, you don't want to reverse, and just keep the edge of your fabric lined up with the edge of the presser foot, keeping it within your seam allowance. So the aim is to move your fabric as little as possible before you stay stitch. So if you find that you're kind of pulling your fabric like this, it's stretching it out, you want to flatten it out and stop it from stretching. You're almost easing it under the foot of the machine. So if you make any mistakes with your stay stitching and you think, oh, I need to unpick that, don't. Unpicking your stay stitching will definitely stretch out that neckline. So now we're at the point of the V. What I'm going to do, pull that out, cut the threads, and I'm going to flip it over so that I'll be sewing on the other side of the fabric to what I did initially. So each shoulder seam, I'm keeping the bulk of the fabric, each neckline, sorry, I'm keeping the bulk of the fabric to the left hand side. I am starting at the top and working my way down. So what that does, it also helps if you were to be stretching it out at all, and this particularly is relevant for a curved neckline, you're bringing it all back into the centre whenever you're stitching both centres in, from both edges into the centre. we're doing that one down to the centre as well. Lifting the presser foot and pulling that out, and just stay stitching is left in your garment permanently, even after you've constructed it, because it's within the seam allowance. You shouldn't see any of your stitching after you have sewn up your garment. So just trim your ends nice and close. You would use a matching colour to your fabric. I'm going to fold this back and check it against the pattern. So what can happen is, if you're finishing your neckline with a facing, and with your facing you're applying interfacing and iron-on interfacing to your facing, that facing will stay in place. So your interfacing will stop your facing piece from stretching out of shape. Whereas the neckline, the garment, doesn't have that interfacing on it to stop it from stretching out. So we can see here that this neckline still matches up with the pattern, and that's what you want. After you've stay stitched it, you don't want it to have grown, you want it to stay the same as the pattern, because once you come to put this to your facing, they still need to fit. And that is what can happen if you stretch it out of shape. So this is a particularly tricky fabric when you have got an open weave, that it would be much more of a risk factor than a densely woven fabric. So now I'm going to show you this round neck. This is actually the back neck of the same pattern. So the pattern we're working on here is the I Am Patterns Gaia top. It's a V-necked sleeveless top. I've just unpinned the pattern from the back neckline, and we'll open that out like that. So for the back neckline, it's these parts here where you're on that curve and it's on the bias that potentially would stretch out of shape. So we're going to start at this shoulder seam, come down to the centre, then we'll flip this over, start this shoulder seam here and come down to the centre, and do it in two separate parts, so you're pushing everything back into the middle. But most patterns do tell you to do stay stitching on your neckline before you do anything else, but if your pattern doesn't, a woven pattern with a curved neckline, I would always recommend that you stay stitch it first before you do anything else. Stay stitching really doesn't have a purpose if you forget to do it and then do it later, because at that point the damage has already been done. Okay, so the same on the other side, coming back down to meet the stitches in the middle. That is the neckline on the back done. Stop that from stretching out. It should still match the pattern. It should match the facing when we sew that on, and it just helps stop these necklines from stretching out of shape, giving you grief when you don't need it. This simple step will stop that from happening. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel for more great Learn to Sew videos that will help make you a better dressmaker.